apologies for the delayed start. One of the wonders of being in person again is traffic. So this panel discussion is called Designing Resilient, Inclusive, Smart, and Safe Public Spaces in the Caribbean. We're excited to have all of you this morning, and we're excited to have these fantastic panelists to be able to share on this particular topic. And the objective of this panel is to give a brief introduction to a model that has been developed across the Caribbean called Resilient, Inclusive, Smart, Safe CIDS. We have a lot of urban design models, but do they take into consideration small island developing states? Do they take into consideration the issues with regards to accessibility and inclusivity? We want to look at how gender responsive and participatory urban planning results in wider socioeconomic benefits, not only for women, but for all persons within our communities. Also, looking at the barriers that sometimes can prevent us from planning in a gender responsive way. The main purpose is to showcase inspiring Caribbean urban solutions that enhance safety and resilience for all. My name is Tawny Broadba. I am the representative for the UN Women Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean. And again, good morning. I'm excited to be here, not only because I think this is one of my first in-person events in Barbados, even though we are based in Barbados. This is the first in-person event that we have had in Barbados for a very long time. And because we're crossing into an area that sometimes we don't think that UN Women, for example, an entity for gender equality and women's empowerment, would be engaged in. What does gender equality have to do with urban design? What does gender equality have to do with safe spaces? These are interconnected issues, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. We have fantastic panelists that will allow us to do so. But before we go any further, I would like to introduce the UN Habitat partner. They are based in Kenya. They unfortunately could not make it from Kenya this morning. Ellen Andresdottir Fabry will be greeting us from Nairobi. Ellen is managing the Her City initiative at UN Habitat, which is the United Nations Human Settlements Program, Global Public Space Program. She previously worked with Sustainable Cities as the Sustainable Cities Program Director with the Swedish independent think tank for global unmanning. She has been active in advocacy work for setting up the 2030 Agenda, the New Urban Agenda, and other sustainable urban development policies. So I think it is going to be a pleasure to hear from her opening remarks, which will be virtual.
Thank you, Tony. Do you hear me? Everyone? Yes, you do. Good. Yes. I was properly introduced by Tony. So good morning to you and good afternoon here from Nairobi. And as you heard, I manage the Her City initiative here at UN Habitat headquarters in Nairobi. And we're very happy to be here together with UN Women. And we hope that we will be working together in the future in the Caribbean. And thank you for inviting me to the Caribbean Urban Forum. So I would have loved to be part of the panel, but I will give you a little bit of an introduction as I'm here remotely for sake of organization. So I would like to start by pointing out that, as you probably know, people increasingly live in cities. And today, more than half of the world's population live in urban areas. But cities, on the other hand, only account for 2% of the world's surface, but stand for 70% of the energy consumption, 70% of emissions, CO2 emissions, and 70% of the global GDP. And as you know, cities are growing. By 2050, over 70% of the world's population is expected to live in urban areas. So over the last decade, this rapid acceleration of urbanization has really resulted in a diversity of opportunities, such as access to education, jobs, economic independence, political participation, and increased quality of life. But at the same time, it also brought many challenges and threats for particular populations. So we see that poor urban planning has really led to an increasing number of informal settlements, rising inequalities and segregation, as well as this really spiraling energy consumption, pollution, emissions. And as you know, 1 billion of the world's population already live in informal urban settlements, and they're expected to grow with rapid and unplanned urbanization. Urban residents, especially the vulnerable groups, are then exposed to greater risk from climate change and related disasters, both natural and man-made. And in general, women and girls are more vulnerable to climate change due to their unequal social and economic status. And their choices and options for safe habitats are limited, and all at the same time, I mean, their voices are not really, are totally excluded often in the process of urban planning and design. Already in 2016, this is nothing new. The World Cities Report highlighted that 75% of cities worldwide have higher levels of spatial inequality than compared to 2 decades before. And at the same time, we see that the number of children and youth in world's urban areas are steadily growing, and that is particularly in the global south. So as a consequence, as the most vulnerable populations are girls and young women in socioeconomically vulnerable urban areas. What is particularly alarming when it comes to rapid urbanization is the rise of insecurity, particularly for girls and young women. Life in urban settings is also accompanied by sexual harassment, exploitation, and unsafety for girls and young women. And it's difficult to try to navigate this increasingly complex urban environments. But on the positive notes, we've seen much thanks to recent research, actually, that when consulted, girls tend to plan with diversity, the majority, and the environment in mind. And we really believe that supporting youth and girls in developing their competences, knowledge, and skills about their local risks in their home environment, how to mitigate them, and how to be better prepared to deal with these risks is most efficient way and tool to deal with these problems. And we believe that this will really save lives and also resources and provide a generation of aware and active citizens who can really help to build a more resilient urban future for the many. So when we're having women, especially female youth and girls, as these agents of change, they can really support to build a more global, sustainable, and safe urban environment. But we need to create a space for them to participate in these processes and really make use of current technology to foster this kind of community level collective climate action. So just finally, I would like to share with you a bit what was said also in the beginning. We're happy to have been able to work based on the Urban Girls movement that started in through 2017, I think, to continue working on consolidating methods and tools for participatory urban planning and design together with girls. That's why UN Habitat launched the Her City Toolbox, and we're now partnering with multi-stakeholders and UN agencies worldwide, such as UN Women in the Caribbean, to implement this approach altogether. The bottom line is really to mainstream gender equality and youth engagement into current urban planning, design, and implementation processes and practices. And we're really happy to be able to provide this toolbox with the tested methods and tools that have been developed by a variety of multi-stakeholders and tested in so many different cities worldwide. So we invite you to discover the Her City Toolbox on the Her City UNHabitat.org platform to use in your local projects in various parts of the Caribbean. And we look forward to make you join this group of 12 partnership projects that we already have in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America and Europe. Finally, I would just like to say that what we've seen so far testing these tools in these various locations is that even if they vary greatly in geography and character, there's so many commonalities, and the most outstanding result is that these girls really tend to value and propose solutions that are of common good character. And they really propose designs that are long-term sustainable, and they really have consequences for both people and planet. So we look forward working with you and all other relevant stakeholders to develop resilient, sustainable, and inclusive and prosperous cities and towns in the Caribbean. And thank you for listening, and I wish you a very nice panel. And thank you for inviting us to the Caribbean Urban Forum.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's really been a pleasure to be a partner with UN Habitat, and the model that will be presented today is based using the Her Cities model as well as a Safe Cities model that UN Women had developed in Latin America and across the world. Ellen, we hope next time to see you in person in the Caribbean, or perhaps you can bring our fabulous panel to Kenya the next time. I think it's really critical to think about how we use cities. Just this morning, on Beckles Road, on the way to drop my son to school, I saw a man collapse on the street. An older gentleman fell face first on the street. And I was so grateful that there was a sidewalk. I told our driver, I said, stop, we need to help. A taxi man came out and helped. And I kept thinking, not every road in Barbados has a sidewalk. If he had collapsed into the road somewhere else, that may have been a different outcome. This is urban planning. This is how people, elderly people, men, women use spaces. And as Ellen was saying, when we think about girls and women and their engagement in planning, we're thinking about them at the different life cycle stages. What does a young girl coming back from school need in terms of a safe space? Isn't that something similar to what a young boy would need? We're using the entry point of the girl because when they grow, we see, what would a pregnant woman need? Is the need of a pregnant woman similar to that of someone who has reduced mobility, someone pushing a stroller? These are some of the things and why we're using women as the entry point, understanding that this will benefit many people. So this is now my pleasure to introduce the next person who will be speaking, our keynote. Heather Pinnock is a good person. That's the first thing. When we start talking about people, we talk about their accolades, but she's also a very good person who is a Jamaican placemaker and champion of sustainable tropical living. She's a development professional with formal training in architecture, urban design, and project management. And she has over 23 years experience in construction and real estate. And Heather, in her previous position as the Urban Development Corporation Executive Director in Jamaica, was able to create a lot of public spaces for enjoyment, understanding that these spaces have a direct impact on security and citizen security. So it has been our pleasure to engage Heather. She is now a UN Women consultant who has supported us in the design of this model. So Heather, without further ado, I hand over to you to give the keynote presentation.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to invite the rest of you guys to sit at the front.
Yeah, it's hard to turn.
Esteem. Okay, good morning. It is my pleasure to be here. I really enjoy Barbados. And Tony, I also saw that gentleman this morning in the traffic. So I think we're going in opposite directions though. And it is an example of how we use public space and how public space is important. We don't often think of sidewalks in public space. We often only think of parks. But all the space that is used by the public really is considered public space. So I want to start with a quote from the executive director of UN Habitat. And she says, urbanization is a transformative force that can overcome many challenges. And so much of life happens in urban spaces. Understanding and working with it is so important in overcoming a variety of challenges. And then she says, mainstreaming human rights, gender, and social inclusion in all urban development processes will be integral to making sure that no one and no place will be left behind. And of course, that is the very core of the 2030 agenda, which is that no one is to be left behind. And so we want to look at how that happens in urban spaces in general, and in particular here in the Caribbean. So just a quick outline of what I'll go over. I'm going to talk about the definition of terms. I'm going to go from a global context, a gender sensitive context, or Caribbean context, and then come to the key elements of the model. So it's very important, of course, to be clear that we're all clear that we're using the same definitions for the words that we're sharing. So I want to start by talking about Caribbean. I think we can all agree that we understand the definition of Caribbean. It is, of course, the region that we're in, Bahamas to the north, Belize to the west, Barbados, we are in the most eastern section of the Caribbean, and Guyana and Suriname to the south in the South American continental mass. And the region is very varied, a very fascinating region. We have small island developing states, we have continental land masses, we have different cultures, we have different races, we have different currencies, we have different languages. It is quite a fascinating area, the Caribbean. And so planning for it really requires for you to think in a large way and think about all of the options and all of the people that live there. So I'm going to go through resilient, inclusive, smart, and safe in a little more detail. And of course, SID stands for Small Island Developing States. In this conversation, we're really speaking about SIDS countries in the Caribbean, but of course the model could possibly be applied to other territories in the region. And finally, I want to touch on the word cities. We use the word cities often, and there are a variety of global definitions of the word city, and we recognize that some Caribbean cities really do not meet that criteria that we would use to describe a city, but we are using this word as all-encompassing for urban centers, capital towns, and all really human settlements across the Caribbean. So I'm going to go into the definition of terms. I don't like slides with too much text on it, so I've highlighted the part that's important for you in blue. So let's talk about resilient. The UNDRR defines resilience as the ability of a system or community or society when exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its basic structures and functions through risk management. So that's the essence of what we're aiming for with resilience. Inclusivity. UN defines social inclusion as the process of improving the terms of participation in society for people who are disadvantaged on the basis of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, economic or other status, through enhanced opportunities, access to resources, voice, and respect for rights. Social inclusion is both a process and our goal. Smart. UN defines a smart city as an innovative city that uses information and communication technology and other means to improve quality of life and efficiency of urban operations, how things work in an urban center, and services and competitiveness, while ensuring that it meets the needs of the present and the future with regards to generations with respect to economic, social, environmental, as well as cultural aspects, which is essentially the definition of sustainable development right there, that last section, meeting the needs of the future and the present and addressing economic, social, and environmental. And finally, safe. UN Habitat focuses on three major threats to security, safety and security in cities. One is crime and violence, two is insecurity of tenure and forced eviction, and three is natural and human-made disasters. So we want to be able to respond to all of those as a part of safety and security in our urban spaces. And I went on to add more to that though, in that UN Women focuses again in ending violence against women, including gender-based violence such as sexual harassment against women and girls, particularly in public spaces. So now that we've spoken about the definition of the terms, I want to start off with the global agenda. And I had mentioned before that leaving no one behind, which is a core part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And we have the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals are all a part of everything we do. But in this particular instance, I'm focusing on Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. Of course, the project also looks at Goal 5, which is gender equality. But I'm going to go through in particular looking at Goal 11 and how gender is a part of addressing Goal 11. So Goal 11 is about building sustainable cities and communities. And Ellen gave us some good stats in her introduction. I think they were very useful to put us in the context of how urbanized and how continually urbanizing our world is. And by 2050, almost 70% of the world is expected to live in cities. For comparison, in the Caribbean, by 2050, we are expected to be closer to 75%. So we are urbanizing in the Caribbean at a slightly faster rate. Not every single island, but cumulatively at a slightly faster rate than the global rate of urbanization. And I want to speak of the targets. So each goal, each of the Sustainable Development Goals has specific targets and action items and outcomes. And there's a target 7 on the Goal 11 says that by 2030, we aim to provide universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. I note that this definition actually could have gone on a little longer for describing the people, but you will see that one of the things is looking at this target in the SDGs almost matches the title of our project. So I want to give you some global context, and that's a photo of the space right outside. And I thought it was such a wonderful public space. I had to put it in my presentation because there are some things that we don't realize about public space. So UN Habitat has done some estimations of how much public space there should be. And their recommended average is that 40 to 50% of urban land should be allocated to streets and open spaces. Now think about that. That is half of the land in urban areas should be allocated to streets and open spaces. Now, of course, streets take up a lot of space. We're aware of that. So a big chunk of that would be streets. So you see, it says 30 to 35% of that 45 to 50% is streets and sidewalks. Note it says and sidewalks, because streets alone, streets are designed for specific use, largely for vehicles, and sidewalks are the part that are designed for the pedestrians, for people. And sidewalks, of course, then lead to pedestrian bridges and other things that you can safely move around as a pedestrian in the urban spaces. And what that leaves now is 15 to 20% of your urban space should be open public space. Open public space can touch a variety of kinds of locations. So we have lovely spaces like this. Sometimes it's just the space between. It's how you treat the space between buildings, because this is really just a space between buildings. And they've made it into a lovely park, a place to stop. There are things we need to think about in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, it's either hot or raining. So we always need we need shade. So the shade either from the sun or shade from the rain. So it's important that you plant trees or provide some other kind of shade. And these are simple things that make these public spaces useful, livable, enjoyable to be in. Yesterday when I was leaving, when I took this picture, you know, the benches were all empty. But when I was leaving, there were lots of people sitting there. There was nowhere to sit. And that speaks to the usefulness and effectiveness of that public space. And it is a simple gesture by the bank to fix up that little space and put those benches. But the impact it has on the community is so important. And so another global context that I want to touch on these, I won't go into too much detail or I'd be here too long. Really, if you want to remember something, the one I've done in bold at the end is the key point I want you to remember. So placemaking globally looks at how do we make good quality urban space? What makes it good? I gave you a Caribbean example. We need shade. But there are things that are needed in other places. How does it work? What difference does it make? But one of the most important things is sociability. People feel a sense of place and attachment to a place that fosters social activities. So if there's a place that you always go to do something, or a place that your community goes to do something, you then form an attachment to that space, and it becomes an important part of your community, and it becomes a reason, a part of why you like your community, because of the spaces that are in it. And so that is an important part in developing public space, is making sure that it responds to the social needs of the community that will be using it. Another element I want to talk about is CEPTED. CEPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. Now, Tani mentioned that I'm an architect, and in architecture school, they go through a number of things about how you design for, how you address making security nice and safe, and all the things about physical security and surveillance. And even if I look in this room, I see cameras and things that limit your way around. But one of the most important elements of design in urban design is understanding that places that are overlooked, and that's the last point, defensible space, places that are overlooked or walked through or that there are eyes on are somebody up there could be looking down and seeing what's happening to you. You know that there are people in these buildings who may be looking out. So you feel safer because you feel that there are eyes on you. You feel that it's overlooked. You feel that it's unlikely that somebody could get away with trying something in that space. If the space was somewhere else with just a wall and something blank on the back, you don't know. You're not certain that if you go there and something happens to you, that somebody will see. And so the notion of defensible space is space that is overlooked, that is clearly defined as public space, and that not only does the community own, but the community occasionally peeps out. It's kind of like why you put your kitchen sink by the window, so that when you're in the kitchen doing stuff, you can just check what's happening outside. And we all know we do it. And that's one of the reasons why the kitchen sink is at the window. So when you're spending time there, you're able to defend your space. So now I'm going to go from global to our gender sensitive context. So there is a program, a UN Women Global initiative called Safe Cities and Safe Public Spaces. And it looks at a number of concepts and responses and ways that we need to look at how we address safe cities and safe public spaces, particularly for women and girls. And I want to go to the fourth point again, in particular. And one of the most important things is promoting inclusivity. And that is fostering social and gender norms through policy, planning, implementation, and long-term management. So you'll note that inclusivity, which is thinking about all the people who could be involved, all the people as a part not only of planning a space, but how you implement the space and how the space is run for the long term. It also speaks to policy and by extension, legislation, and how you can have those things support and reinforce these activities for the long term and at a national or even at a regional level. And I'm going to, again, touch very quickly on her city because that's really what Ellen spoke about. But I think an important statistic to put up there is 60% of women worldwide in preparing the Her City documents. They did a number of assessments, and 60% of women worldwide feel unsafe in public spaces. That is a significant number. That is a number that must be addressed. There must be a way to address that. And Ellen usually puts up slides with lots of data, but I'll tell you that of all the things she has put up, this is the thing that stood out in my mind. And so that's what I've selected to share with you guys. And I hope you remember that, because that is what we need to respond to. And the Her City tagline is "Let her guide you," because the principle is, as Tani explained, the girl is an example of one of the most vulnerable members of our community. For many reasons, a girl really represents one of the most vulnerable members of any community. And so the thought is that if we let citizens who are rarely heard be the experts, our cities and communities will become more inclusive, more equal, and more sustainable, because they will see things very differently than we do. We officials, we trained people, we people who have spent time in university and researching stuff, may not see things at all in the way that a girl may see it. And there is value, of course, in hearing from those who are not the ones we usually hear from. It's also important as a part of Her City that we look at intersectionality. So it considers the needs of all users in addition to the female population. So it's not limited just to girls, but it uses them as an example of your most vulnerable communities. So now I'm going to go to the Caribbean context. Again, as I started by saying, the Caribbean is a unique and fascinating area. We have our geography puts us in a unique position for many of the small island developing states. We're in the Atlantic hurricane belt. Hurricane season just started. It is something we live with half of our lives. I know we don't think about it, but hurricane season is 6 months. That's half of the year. Half of our lives, we're under threat. Everybody in the Caribbean for half of their life is under threat of possible hurricanes and storms. Again, something that we live with, but really that's a high risk. We must address it as part of our planning. 70% of Caribbean people live at or near sea level. Of course, that's something to be considered with our continued changing climate, coastal erosion, sea level rise. That is a lot of people in a vulnerable position. Almost all cities and major infrastructure, including things like airports, ports, major highways, big investments in hotels, hospitals, nearly all of that kind of infrastructure in the Caribbean is within 1 mile of the sea. That means all those investments that we make and continue to make are all at risk, because we know we're in a worsening environment based on the effects of climate change. But this is our reality. We are a small island developing state, so we continue to invest even though we know we're in a vulnerable position. Then we have a shared historic foundation, and I'm speaking specifically here around the English-speaking Caribbean, but it's not unlike that in others, which gives us a British colonial baseline to both our urban planning policy and standards, as well as the cities that we have to work with. So the layouts that we will find, the urban cores of many of our English-speaking towns are very, very similar and have similar layout and similar issues. Then we have the economic limitations of being small island developing states. We have small economies, many of which are very dependent on tourism. Some of our countries carry high debt burdens. We know that the head of IMF is visiting right now. And so in that context, there is always limited funding for development. There's limited funding for looking at long-term urban planning. There is a limited funding for building out, even if you build it out. As Tony said, I've had the delight of being able to build 2 awesome public spaces in Kingston, in Jamaica, one in Kingston, one in Montego Bay. But that's not the hard part. The hard part is keeping them going, keeping them safe, keeping them clean. That's the hard part. And those are some of the things that need to be a part of long-term budgeting as well. So just doing or building it, that's a big spend, but the hard part is maintaining it, keeping it safe, keeping it clean for people. And finally, for the Caribbean context, I want to talk about our cultural use of public space. In the Caribbean, it's hot, and a lot of our lives are lived outdoors, and public space starts just beyond your door. So everything from hanging out on the veranda, watching people go down the street, hanging out at the street corner, playing dominoes on the sidewalk, street parties. We have famous street parties in St. Vincent. We have street parties in Kingston. And to one of the main things that happens in the Caribbean, which is festivals and carnivals. These all happen in our public spaces. If you think about any road in Bridgetown or any road in Kingston, or of course, above all, any road in Port of Spain, there's nothing quite like imagining it with the crowd going down with their feathers. It's a completely different experience of a public space. So when I lived in Trinidad, I was there for months, and there were just roads that I went on every day, didn't seem particularly special. And then Carnival came, and those roads became a different world. And you knew the roads were special because there were banners started going up across specific roads, and little shops were built along specific roads. And before they didn't strike me as important, but then came Carnival, and these specific roads and thoroughfares and public spaces became the most important spaces in Port of Spain for 3 days, from Friday to Wednesday till Tuesday. So it is amazing how something that seems ordinary for the other 362 days of the year is the most important public space in Port of Spain for 3 days. And so that is an important part of how we think about our Caribbean context. I've not been able to do crop over yet. So I'll, hopefully next year I'll add that to my descriptions. But it is so important that we understand how much of our life and how much of our celebration and how much of who we are happens in our public spaces. And that's why it's important to plan for it. So in the context of this particular model and the work that we have been doing, we've been focusing on these English-speaking countries in particular. So I just wanted to make that clear. And now I want to talk about how we bring this all together to make a model. Almost done. So we look at the global context. We look at the context of our vulnerable groups being gender sensitive and socially inclusive. And we look at our Caribbean context, understanding the real risks of our climate and disaster resilience needs. And we come together to form a Caribbean model. And I want to just touch on the key elements of the model. And actually my time is almost up. So I will talk about the key elements. So we have the key elements on the resilience, which is, again, that our design is and construction is climate responsive, that we have an economic and financial model for development, but also long-term management, that we use durable, long-lasting public furniture, landscaping, things that are suitable for long-term use by the general public. In inclusivity, we want to look at participatory planning in all of those global contexts that we looked at. Participatory planning came up over and over in each different model and context. And we recognize that's important and that we take an intersectional approach to that participatory planning, that we look at barrier-free access, amenities, and activities for all. Everybody should feel welcome in your public space. And we want locations that are easily walkable, close to transportation, easy to get around. And then for SMART, we look at inclusion in all national technology programs, connectivity options, look for opportunities to collaborate for technical and of course financial support. These things don't work without some financial support for the long term, and including public space as a key part of long-term responsive visioning for where a town, a city, a country wants to go. And then, of course, looking at safety and security, which is such an important part of being in the public space, that spaces are defensible, overlooked, that they are owned by the community, that they have multiple uses and activities, and that there's planned management and maintenance. And I'm just going to end with some examples of successful public space that exists already in the Caribbean. I have an example here from Bridgetown in Barbados, Port-au-Prince in Haiti, Chaguaramas in Trinidad, and Kingston, Jamaica. I'm proud to say that I was a part of that development back in it's about to have its 20th anniversary. Even so, I must have done it when I was 10. And these are These are examples of how we have already in the Caribbean started to make moves towards looking at urban space, addressing these things, addressing how we live with it. But what we want to do is go even further and think about how the most vulnerable in our societies can be accommodated in the ones that we do, in improving these and in the new ones that we do going forward. And I end with a quick quote. Cultures and climates differ all over the world, but people are the same. They'll gather in public if you give them a good place to do it. And there's the best use of public space of all.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that fantastic presentation. So you understand the specifics of the model at this stage, what it is we're looking at when we speak about resilient, inclusive, smart, and safe cities in the Caribbean. And there were a few things when you were speaking that just kept coming to me, you know, driving versus walking in the Caribbean. There was a time when my car did not work and I had to walk. And that was when I started to see, in a very different way, the kind of unfortunate, let's say, disposal of garbage that was happening. I did not see it as much from my car as I did as when I was walking. The other thing, you know, one of the things that is interesting about working for UN Women, even though people roll their eyes when they hear UN Women because they think, oh, these women again, is that you instinctively think about people regardless of their sex who are experts at what they do. And we ended up with a panel of women. We have fantastic women at this panel who I'm going to give the opportunity to share with you some of their expertise. To my right, we have Andrea Dempster-Chung, who is the co-founder and executive director of Kingston Creative, a movement to transform downtown Kingston through the arts. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to Kingston, please go down and visit them. What they have done down there is incredible. She's also the founder of Bookophilia, a bookstore and cafe on Hope Road that promotes Caribbean authors. Andrea is an innovator. She is a global citizen, but beyond being a global citizen, she's a Caribbean woman who's going to share with us some of her expertise this morning. We also have Dr. Deborah Thomas Austin, who is the managing director of the East Port of Spain Development Company, a special purpose state enterprise established by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. This is a position that she has held since the company became operational in 2006. Were you 10 when that happened as well? Of course. So thank you so much for being with us again this morning. And we have to my immediate left, Joanna Edgehill, who is a co-founder and director of Mega Power Limited in Barbados. I want to also say, I know Joanna is a mother, and when I think about her mothering and being the founder and executive director of Mega Power, if you look on the roads in Barbados, almost every car now is an MG. Amazing, amazing what you've been able to do with COVID-19 and homeschooling. Joe recognized a distinct market opportunity for electrified transport powered by renewables and formed Mega Power Limited in February 2013. Mega Power's vision is for a network of publicly accessible charging stations powered by renewable resources, enabling the rapid uptake of electric vehicles in Barbados and across the Caribbean. Now, we've been showing off a lot of the electric buses that are in Barbados. And I think we really have to thank Joanna and the team at Mega Power and everybody else, but for pushing this agenda, for a very long time. So the first question for all of you is, why do you think inclusive urban design is critical to sustainable development? And I'll start first with you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm coming from the perspective of running a small arts NGO, but also being a structural engineer. I've worked most of my career in infrastructure development. And we've come across this thing called creative cities. Kingston is a creative city of music as designated by UNESCO in 2015. And I really believe that creative cities have the capacity to transform lives and to create new opportunities for its citizens. So leveraging this designation is part of the work that we do, and we feel it's critical to diversifying our economy, to making us more resilient to shocks such as COVID, and ultimately to attaining sustainable development in Jamaica. So what our organization is doing is using art and culture to achieve social and economic transformation. Art and culture is a lever. So our vision of success includes both people and place. And so to that end, we're building capacity in creative people, and through creative placemaking, we're developing an art district in the heart of downtown Kingston. And our goal around the city is to use art to revitalize a blighted space, a downtown capital that was abandoned in the Civil War of the 1970s, and to make it a more safe and accessible place for women, for children, for LGBTQ groups, and all other vulnerable groups. And we find that public art and creative placemaking, when used effectively, can be a really good strategy in urban design. It has several benefits. You improve not only the physical space, but people's emotional and social well-being. Their civic engagement improves as they connect on the street. And research has shown very strong links to improvement in public safety coming from the development of artistic and cultural spaces. This approach comes off the broken window strategy that most people are familiar with from New York. You fix the broken window and things slowly improve. But it actually argues that livability is promoted not only by the aesthetic quality of the art, but also the lighting, also through a sense of community and a sense of identity that improves, and that changes the impact on people's behavior when they're in an artistic and a cultural space. And lastly, we really have to start to look at our cities and our city centers and urban centers differently. It was mentioned about, 50% of the world's population living in the urban cities, 80% of global GDP coming from these places. And so we have to start really looking at the creative economy and linking the art and public art to how we can start to use these city spaces as catalysts for inclusion, for innovation, and economic growth in small island development states.
Thank you so much. The people and the places, you've said a lot of the people and the places, and connecting the people to places is something that I think may include in your answer. So Joe, let's go to you next in terms of why do you think urban design is critical?
Oh gosh, at Megapower, we see urban design as being critical to improving air quality, as well as looking at low or zero emission zones. And coming here this morning, it's actually my first time to the central bank in what feels like many years, maybe 2 or 3. And I was really heartened to hear that the shuttle service for this conference is being run by one of the Transport Board electric buses. But as I parked and I walked across, I noticed in the underground car park on my left, a lone vehicle charging point. So the central bank, the driver does drive an electric van, which is great for deliveries. And indeed, he does charge there. But kind of looking more at how do we get to a point where 1 in 10 of public parking spaces is user-friendly for electric vehicle charging. And I think, good planning rather than a charger here or a charger there has so much potential, and that has to come at the kind of town and country planning level. So the developer comes, I would like to have a new development, to build out a car park, really ensuring and pushing that on to the developer, to have that 1 in 10 at least accessible for EV public parking. And that's where the public-private partnership becomes really important in public planning. And this is something at Megapower that, I'm going to speak in the next bit about our charging network and how we've rolled that out. But really that inclusive discussion, and that discussion involving all stakeholders that are both driving electric vehicles, but also the general public as well. Where will charging infrastructure be? Can it be solar carports, or should solar be at a different site, but still supporting greening of our grid?
Thank you so much for that. So if we're talking about the planning and the public side now, I guess, Deborah, same question to you. Why do you think inclusive urban design is critical?
Thanks, Tony, and thanks for the presentation, Heather, and for the opportunity to participate here. So as a land use planner, human settlements planner, I think, and in the particular job that I am in now, I am involved in planning for marginalized communities with people who are themselves marginalized and stigmatized and who need to feel part of the national space, part of the city of Port of Spain. So the area that I focus on is East Port of Spain. And it is important that people see themselves in the place that they live. They see themselves in the city that they live in. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face in terms of allowing people to recognize that they form part of the city. For the other users of the city to recognize that these are legitimate residents of the city who have a right to be there, and not just to be there in roles in which you pigeonhole them to be there. They have a right to participate in all aspects of the city. But as a planner as well, I have tended to see the city in a different way. So I sort of put on a different lens when I move around and when I travel. And the things that we observe in terms of how women who are pregnant women or women with children or people with disabilities or elderly people, how they use public spaces, you recognize that it is something that we have to be aware of and we have to be able to plan for. And so I think those are things that we see in whether it's family members or I have shared with you all that I have moved my father in his 90s around to public events, even some of the carnival shows that Heather talks about, and trying to find a place where an elderly person using a walker could be welcomed and feel safe and be able to move around. Those are challenges that we have. So I think it is important that design is inclusive, that it recognizes that we have to provide for everyone who uses the space at whatever stage they are in the life cycle. Gender, other sorts of factors that are at play there, and we have to make provision for that. So there's awareness, there's training. I think in terms of our planning education, we have to make sure that we are teaching the up and coming generation that these are things that are central parts of planning, and they're not the domain of architects or designers only. They are an integral part of the work of the planning profession. I think there are cost implications as well, because as we plan, we tend to not recognize that some of these things have particular cost implications. And we need to plan for that when we're looking at our budgeting, our construction costs. How do we encourage developers to provide the things that we need without them seeing it as an increase in the cost of development, which now challenges its economic and financial viability. So these are some of the things I think that are important. And I think, of course, in terms of our culture and our history, it's very important that we see that reflected in the spaces that we plan for as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's always interesting coming from the Caribbean. As Heather spoke to, we have such diversity in the Caribbean. We have an interesting history that sometimes we don't always like to remember, but it has brought us to where we are, including in some ways, sometimes no sidewalks. Because as you were speaking about, Deborah, you know, it's not just the abandoned buildings. Sometimes we abandon people, and how we expect them to get around our city spaces is something that we forget. How do the housekeepers get to where they're getting? How do our janitors, how does everyone who contributes a critical role in our society get to where they're going? And how do they live in the spaces that they really embody at this space? So I'll start then from you again, Deborah. What role do you personally play in the design of public spaces? You've shared a bit personally about how you have used the public spaces, including for an elderly father. But what role do you play in the design of public spaces professionally?
So for us at the East Port of Spain Development Company, I don't think we have enough opportunity yet to design fresh new spaces. Certainly the role that we play is in retrofitting existing public spaces. And so that is and they have got to a level where in retrofitting, we do have an opportunity to contribute to the design. So for instance, there are public spaces, recreational spaces that we use that we realize did not really cater for use, especially women. So, you know, men use bathrooms differently. And so if you have public spaces that do not have washrooms specifically designed for women, or washrooms are not available, one, there's a problem. And if they're not separated male and female washrooms, we have a problem. So basic things like that we put in. the lighting for public spaces, recognizing because we use the SIPTED principles a lot in the work that we do, and where safety is a concern in the communities that we operate in. So recognizing that we have to think about those things. What are the things that are preventing people from using public spaces and using them throughout the day and into the evening? So public spaces that are only available to people during the day when they are at work. When people are at work, that's not helpful. So how do we encourage in a Caribbean setting, when people come home from work and into the evening, to be able to feel safe using those public spaces? So we have had the opportunity to retrofit public spaces and to include urban design elements that were not part of the original design. And that has allowed more people to use spaces day and night, encourage women to use spaces. Even if we take basketball courts, for instance, when we talk about a basketball court, it's a male space. And so just by redesigning those courts to put in markings for netball allows women to come in and use the space. Being able to have those spaces lit, being able to have washrooms in those spaces, being able to have pavilion seating, tiered seating, not necessarily a fancy pavilion, but tiered seating, and in some of them even able to put in ramps for persons with disabilities and wheelchairs. So we've had those opportunities and we've been able to use those opportunities. As a matter of fact, right now in my absence, there's a project that we're trying to rush to get ready for an event on Saturday. And it's a public space. And I know we talked about, Heather referred to Carnival and the fact that some public spaces only come alive at that time. This is a public square. It's called the Yoruba Square, near the Besson Street area. And it's located in an area that has a history associated with the slave trade. We're told that slave selling blocks and different things were in that area, and part of the West African Yoruba community settled in that area. And the square is there, but it comes alive once a year when the Emancipation Support Committee hosts a drum festival, which is going to be hosted on Saturday. And so I can't give away too much, but they will be doing a little unveiling in the square. But just realizing that that is a public space that has historical significance that nobody seemed to have thought of. So, you know, we are now looking at, okay, how can we redesign this space to make it accessible and usable throughout the year, not just in June when there's a drum festival for one day. Yeah, so we've had some opportunities, but we would certainly be looking at opportunities for new innovative public spaces as we continue our work.
So Joe, from the private sector, what has your role been in the design of public spaces?
At Megapower, we own and manage a network of 40 publicly accessible charging points across Barbados. And the concept is that you're never more than 3 kilometers from a public charging point. So closest to here would be city center car park in town, then driving, I guess, up the West Coast at the University of the West Indies, then heading further to Massey. And actually at most of the Masseys, there's a public, the supermarkets, there's a public charging point. And we've looked at locations where people want to spend time, as well as, you know, what is convenient, what is accessible. So let's take city center car park. I think it's 5 floors. It could be 6, I'm not sure. It could be 7. Is it 7? I don't know. But looking at, you know, where to put that charging point and working in a partnership arrangement with the landowner or with the government or with the shopkeeper, whoever is ultimately then the first point of paying the electricity. So working closely with them and also looking at where is the most convenient for the driver. So not to put it on floor 7, if indeed there is, you know, looking at putting the charging point in one of the shaded floors as close as possible to the lifts or the stairwell. What we've tried to do is put the charging point as close to what would be the disability spots, not in the disability spots, but as close as possible, typically to the disability spot, clearly marking it and ensuring that, you know, we paint the car parking bay green, we stencil EV parking, to encourage those with an electric vehicle to park there and not, you know, any and everyone, with clear signage as well, and in a well-lit location. So these are some of the things that we've done with our public charging network. And there have been cases where, the developer or the landowner maybe doesn't want to put it in that spot because it's, you know, a lengthy cable run, for example, or they see those spots as being very popular and they don't want to give them up. But over the years, it's kind of turned around where more and more developers, owners are coming to us rather than the other way around. So it's persons, businesses actively wanting electric vehicle charging in their car park, seeing it as an added amenity, as a service, as part of maybe their greening initiative.
Thank you so much for that. And I've been seeing more because I do hope eventually to invest in an electric vehicle soon. Over to you. What role have you played in the design of a public space?
Well, it's very interesting because we started off seeing ourselves as catalysts in terms of creating this art district. And that's because our role is very nuanced. We do not own the real estate. We do not have the capital. We do not make the policy, right? This is the state, the government, and private sector. So the tools that we have in our toolbox are inspiration. So we create small projects that, you know, show what's possible, negotiation, education, and advocacy. So we're constantly beating the drum about the need for making a place for our creatives. Highly creative population, they need a central space where they can do business and where they can showcase their talents. And so what we have done in terms of developing the space is we've developed over 70 murals. We have held festivals. We've done visits to museums, to synagogues, to cathedrals, really bringing, we've also kind of bridged a social divide and an economic divide by bringing different communities into downtown that perhaps would not have gone before. We do things around, you know, hearts and minds, kind of removing the stigma around downtown as well. And so for us, it's not a game of how many multi-million-dollar art spaces have we built, or how many star architects have built new theaters. That's not how we count success. For us, if in our role, we have made downtown a little more livable, if we have changed people's perception of downtown and the people who come from downtown, so they no longer have to lie on their job application to say, you know, to put another address so they can get hired. If we can make those kinds of small shifts, then we would have been successful.
So can you give an example of one solution that enhanced the safety and resilience of your area, who it benefited and why? And we're looking at the most marginalized, knowing that many of the most marginalized are also agents of change. So we're not only looking at their vulnerabilities, but their capacities and opportunities to build on them.
Yeah, so one example would have to be the Kingston Creative Art Walk. And the Art Walk is both place and festival. So there's a physical mural walkway in a lane, murals to your left and right, that connect to the Institute of Jamaica, which is our museums. So there's Picture a Street where there's museums left and right in downtown Kingston. And then it connects that with the National Gallery of Jamaica, the only national gallery of art in Kingston. And so this mural walkway, people have termed it the Art Walk. What we were calling the Art Walk was the festival that activated the space. But as you know, it's not what you think it is, it's what the people think it is. So the Art Walk ended up being a monthly festival that had performances at different locations. And that really, I think, was a project that it brought people in, it created commerce, it involved the local bars, it brought people from different social strata to go and drink at a bar, to have conversations. There were social interactions in the street. And I think that's been one of our most, you know, I would say our flagship project that has had the most impact. Now, in terms of who has benefited, you have to look at who showed up. So we've had trans women in heels and dresses in Jamaica, which is an extremely homophobic society, as we all know, and we're all working to change. We've had them at our festivals and at the events and at the museums, you know, just living their lives, just being themselves. And it may sound small, but it's huge. The elderly show up. We have people in wheelchairs. We have people with walking sticks. We have children that show up. And in Jamaica, there's precious little you can do. When you become a mother, you realize there's nowhere to take these kids, you know? So there's not as much stuff for families to do. So we have families coming out to the street. So I would say that, you know, our LGBTQ community has come out, our elderly have come out, our youth have come out, women have come out. I've heard comments as women walk by themselves from venue to venue, from performance to performance, or in small pairs. And they say, oh my God, it feels so safe, you know, and this is not something that we are used to. So for me, these are the groups that have really benefited. And as they walk, they're looking at murals that are overtly about pride, created by organizations like Equality Jamaica. They're looking at murals that are overtly about gender-based violence. I think you've seen one of them, Tawny, when you came. And that really tackle one that celebrates HIV. So they're, well, not HIV, obviously, but living with HIV and surviving HIV and living positively. So as they're walking, they're also getting these visual cues in a very powerful way about these issues that we all want to shift. So that, I think, would be my example.
That's a great example. And I actually went, I think the economic aspect of it as well, all of these small creatives being able to sell their products at the art walk is great. I went with my 11-month-old son, and it was one of the few things we could do in Kingston with a baby.
Just to add, because if you don't know Kingston, there's a horseshoe around the central business district of about 20 of the most marginalized violent communities. So when we talk about marginalized groups, sometimes we don't think about the poor. Sometimes we don't think about the young gang member who also is in a dance crew. So giving that young man an opportunity to come and dance and be paid for his talent is really creating different kinds of opportunities. So, you know, we don't take it lightly. They're also part of what we call marginalized groups.
They are. And I think if we want to look at citizen security, these are some of the abandoned communities that don't necessarily see themselves as part of the vision for a space, which is why the choice of violence sometimes may become one that's more viable. Joe, do you have a solution that you would like to share?
For sure, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the Transport Board's introduction of electric buses into the public bus fleet, and I guess Mega Power's support to that. So I think one really notable thing about Barbados is it's more than 50% of the Transport Board buses are electric, and that's the largest fleet. It's certainly the largest fleet in the Caribbean and the third largest if you include South America. So we fall after Colombia and Chile, which is pretty good going. But really, it's the modernization of the fleet, and as well as the low and zero emission driving and experience for passengers. But for the first time, I think in the history of Barbados, there's disability access. There's a ramp that comes down off the bus. There's also USB charging points on every bus seat. The buses are air conditioned as well. And so just the experience of the traveler is so much more enhanced than what would have been the early 90s diesel buses that as certainly as a cyclist, you did not want to be behind at all. And there are further 10 on the way. So we're very proud of our involvement, and there's still a lot to be done in the area of public transportation. But I would say getting smarter with the buses and certainly getting more comfortable. There's a bay, not just for the wheelchair, but also fold up seats that enhance the experience for mothers with strollers, or indeed children as well. So the buses are a totally different look and shape. They're lower to the ground, generally speaking, which makes them easier to get on and get off. I should be asking the audience, you know, how's your experience been on them? But no, that's really an initiative that the government has led, that we've been able to support to help make public transport safer and more resilient.
And it's actually becoming one of the things my husband said recently is, you know, we have to take a Sunday park and go take the boys on the bus. And that's something we're planning to do. And I've seen other families do it. So it has, I think, for those who have been on it,
Tony, I have a challenge for you. So I did this one Saturday where I just went everywhere I needed to go by bus. And that's going to bring me to the challenge section of this conversation. But I took my son, and just to show, you know, how does public transport work in Barbados? Does it work well? Is it easy to get places? And I mean, the answer is you wait a long time. That is the answer. And there are ways around that, but certainly it was an interesting experiment.
I think that's a challenge that we should all think about, and we can follow up with the government on this as well for World Cities Day or for any other day, because I used to take public transportation a lot in Trinidad and Tobago, and it was very accessible. It wasn't always as safe in certain ways for young girls in school uniforms as it could have been, but it was always accessible and reliable. I use public transportation in Barbados less, but I would like to do that challenge. And I think it's also speaks to what you were saying about different classes in Barbadian society. That's the benefit of public transport. People don't seem so far away. You see who your neighbors are across your neighborhood. And I think that is a challenge I'm going to take up for sure, and see how we can make it a broader challenge. Same question for you, Deborah.
So one of the programs that we have done at the East Port of Spain Development Company, it's something I feel I probably shouldn't even be saying in polite company when I've been hearing about murals and electric vehicles, but it's our latrine eradication program. So we do have, we have recognized that within the city of Port of Spain, within East Port of Spain, we have communities where a high percentage of the population still relies on pit latrines for disposal of sewage. And I know it's not just a situation in Port of Spain. I have worked in Antigua, and I remember looking at their census, and I was intrigued when I looked at the data on disposal of sewage. And you have by septic tank, by central sewage, by septic tank, pit latrines, and then I was intrigued by other and none, those two categories. And so when I see that in the census, I begin to, the mind starts ticking. So, okay, so what are people using? So once we recognize that and realizing that, you know, this was something that needed to be tackled. It started with the mayor of Port of Spain trying to address the problem, and he was unable, he had funding, but he was unable to get contractors to do the work. Working in East Port of Spain is a challenge for safety reasons, security reasons. And so we took on the challenge for him, and we were able to get some small contractors to do the project. So what it is, it's replacing a pit latrine with a structure that cannot be included in the house, but it's attached to the house. So it's a septic tank and soak-away operated toilet, a wash basin, and a shower. And that is something that, while it seems small, we are recognizing that a number of sexual assaults happen to women who are going outside away from the house to use latrines at night. And maybe much of that is unreported. But so bringing this toilet facility, bathroom facility to replace the pit latrines, it's something that contributes to improving human dignity, to addressing public health challenges, and addressing specifically Goal 6 and Target 2 of Goal 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a program we have been doing. We have noticed that so far, almost 75% of the beneficiaries are female-headed households. So we know that it's a challenge for women. And then, you know, we prioritize not just women in households, but households with children and elderly persons, because it's about the convenience, it's about the safety, it's about the sanitation and public health. And as I said, it's about human dignity. Yes.
So polite company needs to use the bathroom too. So I think it's great to hear that project. And what is also interesting is I don't think you would be surprised, but some people may be surprised at how many people in the Caribbean still are shocked that there are pit latrines in use and that people don't have running water. Yeah. One person told me that's a lie. And I said, well, we would have to look at some of the data. What some of the data also shows is that across the Caribbean, 46% of women have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. That's almost half. And I wonder how the smart approach could help with the time that we sit and wait for the buses to come. How can we use these phones now that everybody is a bit attached to give us a better understanding of when the train is coming? And that happened in the States that I was in New York. I was able to see when the bus was coming and when the train was coming. How can we do that in the Caribbean? This is the last question for the panelists before I open up to you to get your questions. It's how do you think this risk model? I'm seeing a lot in the newspaper of rehabilitating downtown Kingston. I know there's work that is one that many persons, the representatives in Speightstown, for example, want to do in Speightstown and in Bridgetown as well, which is, when you look at Bridgetown, a beautiful city that is underused. Trinidad and Tobago, bringing Eastport of Spain into a lot of what's happening in Uptown or yeah, West, West in quotation marks, the notion of West. So how do you think this risk model will benefit the Caribbean and can benefit the Caribbean? And what do you think some of the obstacles may be?
Well, the two takeaways when Heather was presenting was that the model really focuses on placemaking and crime prevention. And I can't think of two things that are higher on our nation's agenda than reducing crime and violence in Jamaica. Jamaica would be wonderful if it was safe, right?
Overpopulated.
Okay. So, the issue of reducing crime, that's a huge outcome and very important at a national level. And then the other issue of creative placemaking, it's a way to unlock all of that talent. Jamaica is too talented to be as poor and as underdeveloped as we are. And there's a way in which this creative placemaking can help to enable creators to get the value and wealth, build wealth for themselves, for their family, for their communities, and then, for the nation through growing the creative economy. So those two things are huge in terms of impact and the impact it could have in terms of just the country's sustainable development. And having a nice framework to achieve this through is huge. So, I mean, I really think that it's very positive, can be very positive, and I'm excited about having a structured framework that we could achieve this through.
Absolutely, thank you. I say overpopulated because I know so many people tell me I would live in Jamaica if only not for the crime,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I mean, overpopulated and that everybody
We'll
would live
take
in
the risk.
Jamaica is
We'll
not-
take the risk.
I agree. I agree. What about you, Joe? What are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, Heather, I love the presentation actually. And I'll speak to smart and safe, smart in terms of use of technology, and certainly in terms of the buses, that technology is readily available and the buses are fitted with data monitoring, GPS. There is no reason why we don't have screens right now at bus stops in Barbados, so that I know I live 5 minutes away to walk there and the bus is coming in 3. Come now, let's leave home. There's no reason that we can't cut down on that gap. And smart also and safe in terms of, you touched on tourism very lightly. In Barbados, I mean, tourism is our business, no? So, and the city of Bridgetown, the cruise ships dock here, imagine a lot more walking spaces through the city, or maybe even a nice electric shuttle taking us up to Golden Square. I hope Golden Square is part of a tour maybe, because that is such a beautiful space. Good. Okay, I'm happy to hear that from the new water feature there, and the you can reuse your own bottles and then fill up there. It is a lovely space. Enjoy the tour, everyone. But having that that walking ability, let's get the volume of traffic and congestion out of Bridgetown. And there are so many beautiful buildings as well. So I would say that yes, looking at the spaces around where we live, both in terms of kind of use of technology, be it knowing when the bus is coming, or just having more green and smart transportation as well to get people around and to really make better use for economic activity as well as social enjoyment in cities.
Thank you so much for that. And you, Deborah, what are your thoughts of the model? How could you use it, if you would use it, and any obstacles as well?
I think the model is very, very relevant to the Caribbean. I think as a planner and involved in the work that I am in, first I see the resilience. As Heather said, we live in islands that are subject to natural disasters. And even though in Trinidad, we think ourselves fortunate that we're not in the direct hurricane zone, we get flooding. We have a rainy season that is 6 months of the year. And due to all sorts of other factors, we are plagued with flooding. So we have to learn to build resilience into the work that we do. In the Caribbean, our economies suffer too much, not to mention the trauma, the emotional trauma, just living with that risk, and the social disruption and so on, the economic cost of hurricanes and disasters, natural disasters, is something that the Caribbean economies can hardly stand. And so we have to look at building more resilient construction. And so resilience is an important part. The inclusivity, working in communities like we spoke today, and I see the value in a model that speaks to and gives us tools, one brings awareness to inclusivity in design and construction. So I think that is very, very helpful. Unfortunately, Andrea, Trinidad is neck and neck with Jamaica when it comes to the crime situation. And so the communities that we support is Spain are communities where crime tends to be the highest in parts of the island. And so we need to look at that safety. How is it impacting the way people use space? People are not coming out of their homes. They're not willing to use public spaces after a certain hour. And how do we address those issues? Just to be safe walking on the streets. And, you know, that's not the cultural things of the catcalls and the sexual violence. And, you know, it's just your physical safety, safety of person and property in public and private spaces. So I think the model addresses that as well. And last but not least, if we look at the technology. And I think COVID has shown us the importance of increasing our reliance on the use of technology. So for us in East Port of Spain, one of the things we have done is put in free Wi-Fi at public spaces, recognizing that many people do not have access to Wi-Fi at their homes. And so I remember in one case we did it at a recreation ground. And somebody was saying they passed in the area at 10:30 in the night and they couldn't understand why all these people were standing outside the pavilion. And then somebody said to them, there's free Wi-Fi in the pavilion. So people just came out to do their thing at that time of the night. So I think that is important as well. And how do we also notice that, again, speaking to the issue of inclusivity, a lot of children in schools in East Port of Spain were falling behind because they couldn't access the online learning because they didn't have devices and they didn't have the infrastructure, the Wi-Fi. So the model definitely presents a framework for us to look at the way we plan and develop cities, and I think it would be important in the region.
Tommy, if I could just piggyback.
Absolutely.
You know, when you mentioned safety, there's an important part that we don't think about. Oops. And the safety has different aspects, right? One is crime and violence, but another then is security of tenure. And as we go ahead with what we do in terms of development in all these different ways, we have to be conscious of gentrification and the risk that that poses, both to our built heritage, our architecture, and just to the communities who would be displaced. So I just wanted to point that out, that, you know, that safety is, how do we ensure, and this model seems to provide for it by looking at that security of tenure. How do we provide for people owning and having tenure in their communities and in their homes? It's an important aspect that the model also seems to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember Bed-Stuy, Biggie's Bed-Stuy, if those of you who know rap, driving through Bed-Stuy when it was still dangerous and seeing someone on a bike at night and thinking, what? And now Bed-Stuy's rents are about 5,000 US, you know, a month, because it's been completely gentrified. And many of the people who lived there, where do they go? Where do they go?
Yeah.
So do we have any questions from the, wow. I hope that means it's been interesting. You can either come up here. I think it might be best if you come up here. Yes. Good morning.
And I work with the National Cultural Foundation. Yes, I am a PhD student, but today I'm here as NCF. And Golden Square is my baby. So I wanted to give you a little bit more about what happened in that process for the benefit of those in the audience. What we did with Golden Square, and I speak from the perspective of being the project officer from the NCF's perspective, but it was a collaboration with the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc., BTII. They were the developers. And I got onto the project because we were selecting the artwork. But why you like Golden Square so much is that we took the time to look at all the other spaces around Bridgetown and some of the challenges that we faced with them when going into this planning process. So it was like the artists and the developers and the landscape architects, and all of us were on top of each other, just making sure that we're all on the same page. What you don't know about Golden Square is that it was a community engineered project, to the point where even the persons who worked in the construction on the actual park came from the community around the city, around the square. Nelson Street, some people know it as the red light district. Sorry? Very important space. But what you also know about Nelson Street is that in the colonial times, it was one of the most prestigious locations to live in the city because of our merchant history. So you would live at the top and have your shops at the bottom. And since having the development of Golden Square, a lot of property owners in the area are now upgrading their properties and so forth. So one of the things about Golden Square, again, I just love my project, is that in terms of planning for the actual performance spaces, what you're talking about, we looked at how many different staging areas we could make out of the actual project. So technically right now we have about 4 that we've created closer to the monument for Clement Payne. That's that area for the acoustic type performances and so on. There are 2 large, there's a large shade structure and the smaller shade structure. When you go on the site, you will see it. We call one the bandstand, and then you call one the orchestra pit, because we tend to turn around the stages and so on. There are still a couple of things as event planners and coordinators and people who work in the creative sector that we want changed a bit, like more access to more power. And again, we were talking about solar and how to do it and so on, but that's at the planning level. And a part of it too would be like loading bays and also storage facilities and so on. So there we got, if we had a wish list, we got about 80% of what we wanted on the wish list. But what it has done for what has not happened on the site is that the engagement across the space has increased. So for example, the shops close by, even in the phase of planning and construction, they would take care of the car parks area, make sure that we had accessibility to that. The church, Bethel Methodist, which is adjacent, we use their auditoriums for rehearsals and for backstage requirements for performers and so on. So it has brought with it, although it has its deficiencies, more engagement with all of the spaces around, the communities around the space. And so far, the signal event for the space is on July the 26th. Again, I'm a crop over girl, I work at the NCF. So the 26th of July, we will celebrate the Day of National Significance, which is the historical significance of that particular space with the 1937 rebellion, Clement Payne and our national hero and so on. But since opening the park, we've been able to host the Caribbean Handel's Messiah version, and we've done a number of activities in this space. So if you haven't gone on the tour, this is the plug now. Please go to Golden Square, because from a planning perspective, not only as the NCF, but also as a creative myself, I would love your opinions on any other initiatives that you think we can add to that space to maximize its capacity and its usage. So thank you. And I was sent to talk to you particularly.
One of the most important things that she mentioned was that process of co-creation. I find that, in planning, you just don't have very many diverse voices at the table. Heather, you will know, you've been in this form of planning, and I'm sure there were very few people that were artists, or people that were elderly, or people that were LGBTQ. We weren't going to go there, but yeah, starting there. Yeah, no, seriously, it is not a very diverse process. And I've worked in government in terms of doing these kind of development projects for years. And being on the outside now in an NGO, it's amazing how hard it is to get a voice in at the planning table, even with, proof of success, proof of concept, big tangible things you can look at. It's very, very hard. The planning process for our cities needs to be more inclusive. More people need to be at the table. The poor, the people from the communities that we say we serve have to be included. And so I don't know how we're going to get from here to there, but I think that has to be an integral part of how we roll out this.
Absolutely. At the core of the model is something that has been said for a very long time. It's not just in the women's movement, but in the indigenous people's movement, in all movements, nothing for us without us. When we create spaces for people without them, we recognize they're not that well used. You need to include the people who you expect to use the place in the planning for the place. Do we have anything else? Anyone else? Yes, please.
Great discussion, really enjoyed it. I'm going to go back to where Heather started with the 35% of city space that is actually streets as public areas. And relate that to what we saw when we went to Golden Square yesterday, which was wonderful. Going there was fine. Getting away from it and back was horrific because of the problem of crossing the road. Not so much, I suppose it was safe, but the traffic had huge periods of time to go through. As pedestrians, we were eventually granted a few seconds to run across the road with a countdown going and telling us that, you know, I don't think it was possible to cross the road within the sort of the green space that was allowed, which is leading to a question. How, to what extent do you think in the Caribbean generally, there will be any acceptance of a change of priority for road users and street users that put the most vulnerable at the top and the least vulnerable at the bottom? So pedestrians, particularly children, parents with children, elderly people, given much longer and much more space and much more priority, and cars just has to slow down and wait a little bit longer. Is that something that will be accepted? I ask that because it's just changed in the UK and there was a huge outcry about it as it was changing, and actually it's working really well. So perceptions don't always match reality.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to let Heather answer that, and please come to the microphone.
Hi, Steve. I think that they're in the Caribbean, we're kind of a few years behind what we've seen happening in other parts of the world. I'm going to speak to Europe in particular, because I think that's where we're probably seeing it most successfully. But there is kind of, a development and an environment Kuznets curve where, as you are starting, things are bad, but as you get better, you start, going down the other side and you're seeing an improvement. I will say to his credit that the mayor of Kingston, Delroy Williams, as I would say Mackenzie, sorry, Williams, has repeatedly in my discussions with him said, how can we do more pedestrianization? How does it work? But I think it's also important that we don't just, and it's a conversation I had to have with him, that we don't just pedestrianize for pedestrianizing sake, because again, if we go back to our colonial roots, quite a bit of the core urban centers in the Caribbean are designed for some amount of pedestrian use. So in downtown Kingston, for example, King Street, which is the King Street, the primary street, is designed with covered walkways. So all the shops and things come up with covered walkways. So there is no need to really, well, let me not say there's no need, but you don't need to pedestrianize to allow space for people because that's designed into the street. Now, if you want to do something else, like use those spaces for restaurants and eating, and then, so you don't want to just apply pedestrianization randomly, but I do think it is a core part of planning. So you want to have pedestrianized routes so that as a pedestrian, you can get from A to B with options for C and D clearly and safely. It's one of the things to do with public space. So after, not even after, in planning public spaces, there should also be planning about how you connect those public spaces. So the Art Walk, for example, is an example of, in downtown Kingston, there are public spaces that I don't think were planned in any formal way. But what we've done is looked at how do we then connect these spaces? And, so there is a destination and there are options along the way so that that pedestrian route is useful because you get on it to go somewhere and along the way you experience whatever else, and then you can go somewhere, another location. So what I would always warn against is just random pedestrianization. Let's just pedestrianize, because it needs to be within the context, obviously, of planning and thinking it through. Again, one of the big risks in our English-speaking town centers is limited sidewalk and public space. So we have zero lot line, buildings that come right up to the corner, which means perhaps the solution is not sidewalks there, but some other place that cuts through that gives pedestrians a safe place to walk. We have a program in Jamaica now about safe passage for students that tries to take kids off some of the dangerous main roads and create walking routes for kids to get from schools to like bus nodes and things without having them necessarily walking on those main streets that are busy where cars are going at a particular speed. Because again, it's also efficient that some roads function. I mean, some roads need to function with cars traveling at a certain speed. What you need to do is keep people away from those roads and give them alternate routes. So if there are ways to really think it out, but this speaks to really thinking about planning, and that it's not, okay, let's do this one. Oh, okay, that was good. Let's go do this one. That there is a comprehensive thought process in how we bring all of these elements together. And I think that is really the most important part, recognizing our history, recognizing what we have, recognizing some of the threats, talking about things like shade. Again, when you pedestrianize, shade, 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 I'll say it 1,000 times. Find ways that people in the broiling sun or in the pouring rain have somewhere to shelter. Those are the kinds of things that we really need to think about in getting that relationship with the cars. We do need the cars, but we need to find the best way to live with them.
Thank you for that. So this is our last question or comment.
Yes, just quickly, first, let me say thanks for your presentations. I'm happy to at least link up with Kingston Creative because the COVID allowed me to steal people's ideas as a planner. So I ran Malone National Housing Corporation. Look across the Caribbean, see what you do. And I was fascinated by what you did in downtown Kingston. I'm really fascinated because as a student, I lived in Kingston, in Jamaica, and I love downtown. I don't think, my fear is that you'll be gentrified out if you're very successful. That is always my fear. Just one comment to my colleague, Steve, especially for the area that you came across Beckles Road, where there's a national housing complex. When I came as a planner at the back end, we wrote a plan that we said we want to change up that space and we want to make it bicycle friendly and pedestrian friendly, has sidewalks. And we want to link it with healthy lifestyle living, walking to the city, moving around, and some simple things about taking a little part of the road and put a little foot as a line to say that is a pedestrian space, and some signage to say this is pedestrian and bicycle friendly zone from Beckles Road right around to the NIS building, right around in a circle, huge area. That is still on my desk somewhere sitting down. Some partition did not agree. Or MPT did not buy in because we don't have the additional space to put in more sidewalks. But I think if we change the culture of the road usage, we can create a safe space for people to walk and cyclists to coexist. Barbados has a cultural problem with cars, even if you bring them electricity. At least now we don't pay road tax because Barbadians used to say to others, you don't pay road tax, go to the road. Those who Barbados will know about that. Road tax is paid on vehicles. We don't pay road tax anymore. So hopefully that culture will change. So I do understand and take the point that you're making about, and it might not be a physical thing like a sidewalk, but it might be signage, it might be a line, it might be, because you're going to Golden Square. And I've also said by Thursday, I realized that we've done the space, but we have not pedestrianized the space in terms of the road, the moving across it. So that's something that the planners have to work on. My other comment that I want to make to my colleague with the town planning and the buildings and the spaces. Please don't put that in the public realm for the governments to do. Do that from the back end with your developers and your architects and your people. Fix it before it comes to the planning agency. My example of that is when town planning took up the mantle of the physically challenged and started to insert conditions for the sidewalks, the parking, and the ramps to the public buildings, you would not believe the hue and cry of the architects and the engineers, how they're going to fit it, how they're going to do it. You would not believe that hue and cry from the developers then. That happened in Barbados. The absolute interesting stories about it. And we stopped and gave a noise and you know, they got back to us later in life with the changes to the act and putting us out to pasture. but do that from the back end with the developer. The developers and the architects have to see the benefit of creating good spaces. That's where it has to happen. It cannot happen from the legislative framework of us as planners. I don't work in the planning department anymore. To have to write a condition to say put down a charging port or space. That should not appear. We should see it on the plan. Don't even have to put a condition. Don't have to put an idea. We should just be there. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. Sign off. It has to happen out there with the architects and the designers and the developers that see the benefits of these things. Okay, so I would encourage you to reach out to the Massey. I don't have an electric vehicle. I'm a public servant. I can't afford one.
No, it's now loans up to
Oh,
100,000.
that will put me in further debt. Okay, but I do take the point that you're making, that those things are critical, are critical. And once again, congrats on Kingston Creative, amazing thing. And could you, as soon as possible, I am very interested in the framework that you're developing, the model, because as a principal, one principal who design things in national housing, I tell my office, I don't design things from houses for men. They ask me why. I said, a man only needs a blank wall in the house to hang his TV. But the pantry, the laundry, the kitchen, the spaces that make the house livable are things you have to care for women, from single women and women with children. So I want to share that we can collaborate and have some ideas. And I say that as a man who does that work. So don't let the men, or some men are here, don't let I get out that we don't design things for men. Okay, thank you for the wonderful presentations.
Thank you. Thank you all for staying with us. Thank you for that contribution. I will say, we think everybody needs to be there, the legislators, the private sector, the schools. I want to thank all of you for being with us. We've gone over a little bit because we started a little late, but I think you'll see the reason why UN Women is here. We are at the table with UN Habitat on this because this is a people issue, and our agency is about people. It's recognizing what happens at each life cycle of a human being, using the woman as the entry point. Men also will benefit. I'll give a quick example. One time we were doing some training in a particular institution, and the men said, this is not gender equality if we have to, these were the security guards, we have to go and take care of this space, but women don't have to go. The women's security guards don't have to go because the bathroom is not sufficient and men can use outside. And I asked, but wouldn't everybody prefer to have a better bathroom? The women's issue presented the fact that the men were also not having a good use of the space because it was expected they would just use outside. So improve the bathrooms. That's what we do. We will give you more information. Follow unwomen.org, caribbean.unwomen.org. You have Mega Power, East Port of Spain. The work you're doing there is amazing. We need it. We need to bring our marginalized communities back into our broad community. Andre, the work you're doing at Kingston Creative is amazing. We have to make sure how to get the NGOs to the table as well. And Heather, thank you for all that you do and all that you've done already. We will make sure that you have access to the model, and you'll see the next steps that we're doing across Caribbean countries soon in applying the model. So thank you so much for your time, and we will be, watch your space. Thanks, Tom. Ladies, thank you.